As U.S. President Donald Trump is said to be poised to opt out of the Paris climate change deal, will the rift between the U.S. and Europe get even deeper than it has in the past few days after his visit to Europe? And on World No Tobacco Day, we'll take a look at what measures China is taking to reduce its dependence on the weed. Welcome to The Point. I'm Li Xin. Well, the latest U.S. media reports have said U.S. President Donald Trump is poised to pull out of the Paris climate change deal. This comes hard on the heels of his trip to Europe last week, which he described as a great success for America, hard work, but big results. However, that's not how European leaders view the trip, including German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who said the times in which we can fully count on others are somewhat over, as I have experienced in the past few days. She urged Europeans to take their destiny into their own hands. In response, Trump tweeted, "We have a massive trade deficit with Germany, plus they pay far less than they should on NATO and the military. Very bad for the US. This will change." Now, the US expected withdrawal from the Paris Accord will definitely exacerbate the divergence between the US and Europe. To discuss the matter, I'm joined in Washington by Eric Bradberg, Fellow and Director of the Carnegie Europe Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and in Bonn by Dr. Hans-Dieter Hoemann, former President of the Federal College for Security Policy in Berlin. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Mr. Bradberg, let me come to you first. How do you look at the announcement that the U.S. President Donald Trump is expected to pull out of the accord? Does this come as a surprise after all the time we have been hearing him saying this?
Probably not. We've heard candidate Trump at a campaign trail expressing skepticism of the Paris Agreement, and we've sort of seen the signals that a pullout would possibly eventually come. But of course it comes on top of European concerns about the broader U.S. commitment to not only Europe but to also multilateralism and globalization, including his commitment to free trade, democracy and human rights issues, and NATO. So of course from a European perspective, it feeds into the skepticism that they already have about President Trump and the future of U.S. foreign policy.
Dr. Hoemann, I know the news just came out a couple of moments ago. I mean, probably it's too early to have any real German media response to this, but what do you think the German media and the German government might react to this once it's officiated?
Once it's officiated. I really think this is very bad news, especially from a German point of view. Germany is one of the protagonists on this matter, and the Paris Agreement on climate change just brought I would call it a historic breakthrough in this field and in this situation. And I don't think it's politically very wise. So far, the U.S. could hide behind others who are reluctant to follow the agreement, but China has made progress on this. So I think it's a very bad issue, but it doesn't come as a surprise. And this I agree with my colleague here. Climate change was one of the two issues at the G7 meeting at the recent last week, which President Trump attended. And on both issues, Europeans were very deceived, were not happy with the US being reluctant on both globalization, free trade, and on climate change. It doesn't come as a surprise. The German Chancellor, had hoped that the issue could be decided later at the G20 meeting in Hamburg, but obviously the president might decide before that.
Now, we already heard about this kind of ongoing feud between Germany and basically between Europe and the United States. Mr. Bradberg, how do you think the announcement of the U.S. administration to pull out of the Paris climate change deal would make things worse? By what degree?
Well, as my colleague said, climate change policy is a huge priority for the Europeans. So this feeds into the skepticism that they already have about the Trump administration. And this comes, of course, again, on top of the president's trip to Europe, which in many ways was a public diplomacy disaster. Europeans paid attention to his failure to actively endorse Article 5 at the NATO summit, his tough words about Germany and its trade surplus. So it really feeds into an existing skepticism that Europeans already had about Donald Trump and about US foreign policy. But at the same time, Europe has very few options but to continue to engage the United States. And I think we've seen, even though Merkel is criticizing Trump and also saying that Europe needs to do more on its own, she also recognizes that there aren't that many other options than continuing to engage the United States. And in fact, the Chancellor has been very active in developing those types of relationships with President Trump, visiting Washington and frequently speaking to him. So I think we're going to see, on the one hand, continued efforts for Europe to step up its own game, but also efforts to continue to engage the Trump administration, even where there are differences, and looking for areas where there might be similarities and potential for cooperation, even though the times are very difficult.
Yeah, Mr. Bradberg, still to you, has this feud been a surprise to you? I mean, in the past, we've seen that the United States, for instance, spying on Mrs. Merkel's cell phone or using the US's diplomatic institution in Germany as a kind of intelligence headquarters, but we never heard this kind of strong words coming back from the German authorities towards what the US has been saying. What makes it so special, so different this time?
Well, I'm not sure that it actually does. I think the Chancellor has said similar things in the past, that there is a need for Europe to reduce its complete reliance, as she put it, on the United States. That's not a controversial thing to say. Other European leaders have said the same thing. And to call for more European self-reliance. That's also not a controversial thing. Of course, the timing is what we're all paying attention to. But I think it's important not to put this out of its context and to make too much of a big deal about it. Germany remains committed to the transatlantic relationship, perhaps more so than most European countries. And I think will continue to engage the United States. And even though Trump has said these things about Germany, which are very unfortunate in German ears, the United States, even under Donald Trump, has continued the very active relationship with Berlin, similar to the way Obama handled Europe, calling on Berlin, trying to work with Germany. So obviously this is not good for the relationship. It puts a lot of strain on the German-US and the broader US-European relationship, but I think we're going to be able to continue engaging even at the highest level despite these type of comments.
Dr. Heumann, what is the German view here? Do you and your German colleagues observe similar kind of expectation for continued cooperation despite the rifts that we have seen over the past few days?
Yes, there's no doubt that cooperation will go on, but let me say the following about the two remarks, the statements of the Chancellor. Yes, some politicians have said it before, but I think the Chancellor, for the first time, is very clear, because she does not only refer to NATO or to something, but to something which you could call the liberal order. When she said times are gone that you can rely on others, she meant we as Europe, and the others, she meant the US. And both form the liberal order. And the liberal order is based on institutions such as NATO and G7, based on norms such as free trade. And it's dependent on US leadership. So she was saying nothing less that the US president might put into doubt the liberal orders as we know it. And then as a consequence, second statement, that Europe has to take its destiny in its own hands. This is a very substantial statement by the Chancellor, who is not known for very clear statements. She's talking about the liberal order. She's talking about NATO. Europeans expected a clear commitment of the US president to collective defense, to Article 5. They didn't have it. A clear commitment to free trade, which was not given. So this is something serious, I would say.
Finally, very briefly, Dr. Heumann, to you again. How do you see the future possible direction that Germany could look into elsewhere, apart from the United States? Do you think she has an idea when she said that Germany could look somewhere else?
Germany will not turn away from the United States, but she was talking about Europe and taking. What does she mean when she says Europe has to take its own destiny in its own hands? Europe, the Brexit. Europe is said to be in a crisis, but actually, Brexit has encouraged Europe to go ahead, perhaps with different speeds. You had just the elections in France with a pro-European president. You have Chancellor Merkel. They already developed some initiatives about further integrating the Eurozone. There will be some initiatives on security issues. There will be a new relationship between EU defense and NATO. So this is the time now that Europe can go ahead with some of the initiatives already discussed in the past. But that's what she meant. Not turning away from the US, but strengthening Europe.
Thank you very much for that clarification. Now, that was Mr. Eric Bradberg from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and Dr. Hans-Dieter Heumann, former president of the Federal College for Security Policy in Berlin. And here is my very first point. Now, the US has always acted as big brother, towering over its European allies since the end of the Second World War. Now, faced with its own walls and a leader who talks about America first, the US's leadership role in the eyes of its European allies is very much in question. On the one hand, the diminishing influence of the US as a superpower is a reality obvious to many. On the other hand, the atypical president who has come into power as an answer to his domestic problems has added to the anxiety of its followers. It's not clear how much damage President Trump has done to the transatlantic partnership, but the dent is there. And with the expected announcement of Trump's withdrawal from the Paris climate change agreement, the feud between the US and its Western counterparts are likely to last for some time to come. May 31st marks the 30th World No Tobacco Day, with the theme Tobacco, a Threat to Development. China is the world's largest tobacco producer, consumer and manufacturer, according to a report by the World Health Organization, or WHO. According to the report, more than 1 million people die in China every year as a result of tobacco use. That's around 3,000 people every day. By 2016, China had introduced a comprehensive tobacco controls in 18 cities. What progress has China been making in this field, and what more needs to be done? I'm first joined by Dr. Bernhard Schwartländer, WHO representative in China. But before we begin the discussion, let's first take a look at what people in Beijing are saying about smoking.
好几代人都不抽烟，所以都80、90，什么都没病。
吸烟你管不了，你怎么说都不听。
爸爸吸，我高中，我爸爸就不听。
就是那个生孩子之前戒了一段时间，工作压力有时候比较多吧。然后吸烟，吸了好像是4、5年。我烟龄有6、7年了，2、3年了吧。肺部有影响吗？对身体不好吗？获得肺癌的几率比正常人多吗？肺那个变黑吧。
对，呼吸道不太好，然后对肺有，我知道有烟刺，然后还有可能它会肺不舒服，会而且有烟瘾。
To the lung cancer，
肺癌了，什么病全有啊。
Do you think this kind of practice would make a change?
Maybe. I don't know.
不会，看着太恐怖了。
对啊，你们肯定不会的，那肯定不会。
The package kind of does look like the bad thing about smoking, like the blood and stuff.
So the team of The Point on the streets of Beijing asking people their opinion about smoking. Now, Dr. Schwartländer, thank you very much for making yourself available for our show. Now, you were on a TV show in 2014 calling China a smoking dragon, saying that China is facing a very serious situation in tobacco use. What progress has China made in the past few years since you last talked about the smoking dragon?
Now, let me start with some of the basic numbers. The number of smokers has actually increased in China overall, so the rate of smokers has stayed fairly stable, which is of course not very good news. But there are some very good news indeed, in particular around the smoke-free law that has been implemented in 3 of the 4 first-tier cities in Beijing, in Shanghai and Shenzhen. These cities have actually taken action and have made sure that all indoor public places are smoke-free, so that nobody's allowed to smoke in restaurants, in bars, in offices or in hotels. And that has made a major difference for the majority of people who are non-smokers and who have been suffering from the deadly fumes of smokers in large numbers. Now, the big problems that we have is that such a law does not exist for China overall. So the majority of Chinese is not protected from the second-hand smokes, and I think that's one of the major things that we push for, that we ask the Chinese government to move, that such good laws that are in line with the Framework Convention of the World Health Organization are being implemented for China overall, so everybody in China, no matter where they live, is protected from second-hand smoke.
Now, you talked about the numbers of smokers being relatively stable. Why is smoking still so prevalent in China, and what are the main challenges China is faced with compared with some other countries?
Yeah, for that, I think we need to go back a little bit in history. One, tobacco is a product that's the only consumer product that, if it's being used as intended, actually kills half of the people. So one asks the question, how can it be that people actually really start to smoke? Because it's a very addictive substance, and once you have started, it's very difficult to stop again. Now, the tobacco industry has been incredibly effective around the world and incredibly effective in China to sell these products as cool, as successful, as independent. That's the strong people smoke, which of course is all very terribly wrong, especially as the people start to get sick. Now that's something we have to tackle. But what we see is that the education level, for example, overall are still far too low. In some of the rural areas in China, 60% of the smokers don't know, for example, that smoking may cause stroke. 40% don't know that smoking may cause heart disease. I mean, these are very, very high levels of ignorance, I might say, and we have to tackle those. We have to tackle those through better education in schools. We have to tackle those for better education in the media, for example, like the discussion we have right here now. But we also have to put very explicit graphic warnings on the cigarette pack. So each time a smoker pulls out the pack to take a cigarette, they will be reminded how terrible smoking is for their health.
Mm-hmm. And we talked about a comprehensive tobacco control in 18 cities. Do we have somewhat of a timeline as to what might happen in the future? When can we expect a national comprehensive tobacco control introduced in China, in your eyes?
Yeah, that's difficult to say, but I would like to make a little bit of a word of caution on the 18 cities. We have 18 cities where we do have some kind of smoke-free laws or tobacco control regulations, but in the majority of these cities, they're very weak and they're not being implemented very effectively. It's only the 3 big cities, Shanghai, Beijing and Shenzhen, that have really implemented and followed through very aggressively with very, very good laws, and we have seen a major difference there. So in the other cities, we have to still catch up. Now, there's a number of reasons why it seems to be difficult that such good laws can be implemented at the national level. And one of the reasons certainly is that the tobacco industry is a very, very rich industry in China. They have a lot of money. They're very effective in still pushing out their products. They're very smart, for example, something that's really very, very difficult for us to accept, that they're now targeting especially the young people. So they start to smoke, and especially young women. And in young women, the smoking rates have been extremely low. And if you walk today on the streets in Beijing, for example, you see more and more young women starting to smoke. And that's, of course, the effect of very aggressive aggressively reaching out with new products that look chic, that look fancy, like slim cigarettes that young women may find attractive or may think that's something like a beauty product, and in the lack of good education that leads to increasing smoking rates. So there's many things that we have to do, and we're hoping, of course, that a very good draft law that exists for the national level will be passed in the coming year, and we do everything we can to convince politicians, convince leaders, and convince the health sector and also business that this is actually good for the people and that's good for economy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bernhard Schratländer, the WHO China representative. And now I'm joined for other perspective on the topic by Ray Ip, Special Advisor of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Dr. Eric Feigl-Din, Health Economist at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Now, Mr. Yip, your foundation, or the Bill and Melinda Foundation, has provided $14 million so far to support an American university in partnership with 25 cities in China in developing effective tobacco prevention and control programs and policies. So far, what progress can you share with us?
The overall progress that we have observed actually started about the end of 2013, and when there was a sort of a decree or guidance from the State Council, as was the party central office, basically telling the officials they should not smoke in the public, in the meeting. They should not use public fund for buying cigarettes as a gift or as an official function. And that actually, from my perspective, was the most important development, because that signals the higher leaders of China is taking a serious look at tobacco issues. And then also we just heard from Dr. Schratländer, a number of the important cities, which particularly Beijing was the leader in come out with a strong anti-tobacco measures in the public places, which probably will have influence on other cities across China.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Din, now as we have just seen in the interview we did on the streets of Beijing, a lot of people are aware that tobacco can damage people's lung and cause lung cancer, but not much more. They wouldn't associate tobacco use with, for instance, a stroke. What other fatal diseases are related to smoking, and how big is this an extra challenge in persuading smokers to give up?
Right. Well, tobacco, we actually don't just say if it affects smoking. It affects, in terms of lung cancer, affects every disease in the human body except for one, basically Parkinson. But more notably, heart disease, diabetes, and if you actually want to convince people not to smoke, the number one thing you could tell them is actually infertility and erectile dysfunction are one of the major effects of smoking. So in terms of all the cancers, heart disease and diabetes, these major trillion-dollar diseases, I think what could actually convince people the most is some of the actual effects on their personal reproductive health, that you could say. Mm-hmm. And the cost worldwide is, per year, it costs the worldwide economy $1.4 trillion. And in China alone, it costs about $200 billion to the economy a year in terms of healthcare costs and lost economic productivity. Although people don't usually listen to that. People aren't affected by those kind of statistics. They're affected by when it comes to their own personal current health, not just their cancer risk 20, 30 years down the road. And I think that's what we have to educate people right now.
Mm-hmm. And one of the effective ways is actually to bring more graphic messages on the packaging of cigarettes. Mr. Yip, now most smokers we interviewed just now said that if there are disturbing pictures on the cigarette packaging, they probably would not buy them, but they would try to find a different brand with less shocking messages. How do you regard the efficacy of graphic packaging, and how possible is it for China to introduce this kind of packaging in the near future?
This will be a huge impact on the way how people treat cigarette, because for a long time, cigarette viewed as a sign of respect and often used as a gift in official functions, in weddings. So if you suddenly put this rather distasteful and frankly ugly picture of diseased figures, it will make it very hard to present it as a respectful gift in social functions. So that was helps to shift the culture on how people view cigarettes. So I do think, in particular in the case of China, the kind of graphic labeling as they have done in a number of countries probably will have disproportionate impact in the way how people perceive about this product.
Dr. Din, how do you look at the possible effect of packaging in trying to stigmatize smoking so that it's less acceptable socially and in a way to better control smoking?
I think the graphics will help a little bit in terms of reducing the rate of gifting to people. But in terms of actual, the culture-wide stigma of smoking, I think that will require much more. And I think you need to, basically, you know, one in three smokers in the world are in China, and smoking rates are 60–70% in many populations in China. So in order to get that truly down, these small graphics are not going to really help. What you really need, and the most effective, is a cigarette tax. And not just a cigarette tax of 11% most recently instituted in 2015, but we're talking about cigarette tax of 200, 300, 400% compared to the base price of cigarettes right now. And we know that when we instituted that in the United States, cigarette smoking absolutely plummeted when you have a 200, 300, 400% tax. And it's recognized worldwide this cigarette tax is the #1 most effective. And once you break through the 50%, and once smoking is down to 25, 15%, then the entire culture will flip against it, and then it really will have a negative stigma of someone who does it as unhealthy, not as someone who does it for cultural reasons.
Yeah.
Because right now, cultural reasons, you can't just break it with an advertising label. You really need the taxes to bring it down.
Yeah, well, in this regard, China has still some way to go, but we have to leave it there because of time constraint. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Ray Ip, Special Advisor, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Dr. Eric Fagel-Din from Harvard Chan School of Public Health. And as usual, here is my last point. What can one say about smoking that hasn't been said 1,000 times before? We all know it's bad for us, but that doesn't stop millions of people from taking a puff. But stopping smoking can be made to work, as has been shown in some countries where not just bringing in laws, but effectively stigmatizing social smoking have dramatically brought down the numbers. China has still a long way to go in this regard, but we've made a good start. Hopefully, the proof of its effectiveness will be clear for all to see in the future. That's all the time we have for this edition of The Point. As always, follow me on Twitter or visit our Facebook page using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application CGTN Live to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. I'm Li Xin, and you got the point.